I sat by the window, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The air smelled of antiseptic and something softer, something old and worn, like time itself folding in on this tiny room. Eleanor sat in her bed, her frail hands resting in her lap, fingers trembling slightly as if carrying the weight of memories too heavy to bear. "Margaret, do you believe that some people are just born broken?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but edged with something raw, something I hadn't heard from her before. I turned to look at her, studying the deep lines on her face, the sorrow woven into the fabric of her being. "No," I said gently. "But I do think that some are broken along the way." She let out a slow breath, nodding, eyes unfocused, lost somewhere I couldn't reach. "Jack's father, he wasn't always like that. At least, I don't think he was. But by the time I met him, he had this way of..." She trailed off, her fingers gripping the thin blanket tighter. "He had a way of making me feel like I was nothing. Like I was a ghost in my own home." I felt my chest tighten at her words. He never raised a hand to me, not in the way people expect. But his words? His silence? That was worse. He'd look at me like I was made of glass, something fragile and useless. "And Jack?" She closed her eyes, shaking her head. "He was just a boy, Margaret. Just a boy who wanted his father to see him. To love him. And instead, he got indifference, or worse, that cold, calculated disappointment." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her confession settle in my stomach. "And you?" I asked carefully. "Did you love him? Even after everything?" She exhaled shakily. "I think I did, in the beginning. Or maybe I loved who I thought he was. But love turns into something else when you're starving for it. It becomes desperation. It becomes chains. And by the time I realized what I had done, what I had allowed, Jack had already learned to live without love. To seek it in ways that would never satisfy him." I shivered, though the room was warm. Jack. That lonely, tormented boy. The man he had become. The crimes that bore his name. The stories that followed him like a shadow. Eleanor opened her eyes, staring at me now, seeing me. "I know what people say about my son. And maybe some of it is true. But tell me, Margaret. If you take a child and starve him of everything he needs, is it really a surprise when he learns to feed himself in the only way he knows how?" I had no answer. Only silence. And a growing, gnawing ache in my chest. I sat down beside Eleanor, feeling the weight of the room settle over us. The silence between us had stretched so long it had become heavy, almost suffocating. Her frail fingers clutched the edge of her thin blanket, her gaze lost somewhere in the past. "Jack's father," she finally murmured, her voice brittle, as if it might shatter under the weight of the memories pressing against it. "He wasn't the man you might imagine. Not at first." I stayed quiet, letting her ease into the words. I had learned that with Eleanor, these stories couldn't be rushed. He had a charm about him. That's how men like him get you, isn't it? They make you believe they're strong, dependable, that they'll take care of you. She scoffed bitterly. And then, one day, you wake up and realize they never wanted to take care of you. They wanted to own you. My hands curled into my lap. I had seen this before, the slow, insidious way a woman's spirit erodes under the grip of a man who takes more than he gives, until there's nothing left but a shadow. Jack never looked at his father with love, Eleanor went on, shaking her head. Even as a little boy, he knew. I don't know how, but he did. Maybe because that man never looked at Jack the way a father should. He never saw him as a son. Just an inconvenience. I swallowed hard, an image forming in my mind, a small boy standing in the shadow of a man who would never truly see him, never hold him, never love him. What did he do to you? I asked gently. Eleanor pressed her lips together, her breath unsteady. He never hit me, if that's what you're asking. He didn't have to. Her voice turned razor-sharp. His words cut deeper than any blade ever could. You're useless. You're lucky I let you stay. Who else would want a woman like you? She closed her eyes, as if she could still hear his voice, as if the echoes of the past still haunted the corners of her mind. And Jack, it was worse for him. He told Jack he'd never be a man. That he was weak. Pathetic. That no one would ever love him. My stomach twisted. The pieces of Jack's fractured psyche were falling into place, forming a picture I wasn't sure I was ready to see. Eleanor exhaled shakily. And the worst part? She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack believed him. The rain drummed softly against the windowpane as I sat beside Eleanor, her frail fingers absently twisting the hem of her blanket. She had fallen into one of her quiet spells, those long pauses where her mind seemed to drift between past and present, between memory and oblivion. Margaret, she finally murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think we are born broken, or do we become this way? I glanced at her, feeling the weight of that question settle deep in my chest. I had spent enough time by her side to understand what she meant, though she never spoke of it directly. The past clung to her like a shadow, refusing to be forgotten. Eleanor, I said gently, what is it you're remembering? She exhaled a shaky breath, her eyes staring through me, past me, into something only she could see. He was always watching. Always listening, she muttered. Not in a way that made you feel safe. No. It was like he was waiting. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Jack's father? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded slowly, her hands trembling now. I thought if I loved him enough, if I obeyed him enough, maybe he would change. Maybe he would see me. But he never did. And Jack. Jack saw everything. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw a tear slide down her cheek. She never cried. Not even on the bad days. But here she was, breaking, unraveling piece by piece. What did he do, Eleanor? I pressed softly, my own heartbeat loud in my ears. She swallowed hard. He made us feel like we were nothing. Jack was just a boy, she repeated, as if trying to convince herself of something. But his father, he needed control. He needed us to be small so he could feel big. I felt my hands tighten into fists in my lap. I had suspected as much, but hearing it from her lips made it all the more real. Did he ever hurt Jack? I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Eleanor went still. Her breathing shallow, her gaze distant. Not with his hands, she whispered. But with his words. With silence. With looks that told you that you would never be enough. The room felt heavy, the air thick with ghosts of the past. Jack had carried that weight his whole life. A boy who had grown up in a house without warmth, without safety. A boy who had learned that love was conditional, that worth had to be earned. A boy who had eventually walked away from it all, only to become a shadow of the pain he had endured. I reached out and covered Eleanor's trembling hands with my own. You loved him, Eleanor. And you still do. But Jack isn't lost. Not yet. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Just another tear. Another memory slipping through the cracks. And in that moment, I understood, some wounds never heal, they just become part of who we are. I sat down next to Eleanor, feeling the weight of her words press against my chest. The dimly lit room seemed to hold its breath, heavy with unspoken truths that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew about Jack. Eleanor's frail hands trembled as she clutched her blanket tighter. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharp with memory, were fixed on the past, on moments I could only glimpse through the cracks of her confessions. The silence between us stretched long and suffocating. Jack, her voice wavered, barely more than a whisper. He never had a chance. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? I asked, hesitant, not sure I was ready for the answer. Eleanor exhaled shakily. He fought back. Just once. But once was enough to change everything. My pulse quickened. Against his father? She gave the faintest nod, her head barely moving. That night, his father went too far. And Jack, he snapped. Her voice grew even fainter, like a secret the air itself didn't want to carry. There was so much blood. I should have. She cut herself off, the weight of guilt tightening around her like a noose. I reached out, gently covering her trembling hand with mine. Eleanor, my voice was barely above a whisper. What happened to Jack after that? Her fingers clutched mine, desperate, as if holding on to me would keep her from drowning in the memories. She took a shuddering breath, her lips parting, forming words she couldn't seem to push out. But then, she finally spoke. They took him away. But not to prison. No, they sent him somewhere worse. They said it was for his own good, her voice cracked under the weight of the truth. They put him in. A violent cough cut through her sentence, her frail body shaking from the effort. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Eleanor's eyes shone with something close to terror. She wanted to say it. Needed to. But something stopped her. My mind filled in the silence. They put him in. And then, the truth struck me like ice through my veins. Juvenile detention center. Jack hadn't just been taken away. He had been locked up. Hidden. Silenced. I gripped Eleanor's hand tighter as the weight of it all sank into my bones. And for the first time since stepping into this house, I felt something I never thought I would feel for Jack. Pity.
Jack may be here, maybe right next to you.